Good evening. I am Mr. Rourke, the ambassador to your deepest desires. Let me officially welcome you to Fantasy Island.
Yeah!
Blumhouse Productions gave us a rare miss with 2020's Fantasy Island, the slapdash, haphazard mess that barely feels like a horror movie. It seems more interested in being a comedy than it is being a horror, which would be fine. Horror comedies are great, but unfortunately, Fantasy Island isn't very funny, nor is it scary. It's hokey, it's tonally dissonant, and it overall just sucks. This attempt at bringing the careful what you wish for adage to the fore of people's minds ended up being a cautionary tale about bringing dead franchises back to life. The film is a horror reimagining of the 1977 television series of the same name. The TV series was a fairly light-hearted fantasy drama that featured a ton of guest stars having their wishes granted by a magical island. The generous and possibly immortal Mr. Rourke, played by the outstanding Ricardo Montalban, and his trusty companion Tattoo would welcome guests to the island and grant their fantasies. Sometimes his guests would pick a dangerous fantasy, and Rourke would sweep in to save them and teach them a lesson about the nature of their wishes. Blumhouse's version asks, what if there's no moral lesson, and Mr. Rourke was kind of a dick instead? Michael Pena plays Rourke in this iteration, and the character is decidedly uninterested in helping anyone out of their perilous situation. And despite him being an outstanding actor in pretty much everything else he's been in, Michael, like the rest of the cast, don't have much to work with. 5 unsuspecting travelers, Melanie, Gwen, Patrick, and brothers JD and Brack, show up to make their wildest dreams come true. Right off the bat, I have to wonder, who asked for this? Who was the target audience? I can't imagine that grandmothers wanted to see a version of their favorite TV show with Lucy Hale electrocuting a woman. Younger audiences are also likely not familiar with the television series, so the callbacks to the original mean absolutely nothing to them. It's such a bizarre concept. It's like they wanted to use the name Fantasy Island and borrow some of the elements, but they had no respect for what made the series charming. Part of the appeal of the original Fantasy Island was that it was corny, campy, and over the top. Hypothetically speaking, those are qualities that could work really well in a horror movie, yet none of them gel with the script we have here, which doesn't seem to know whether it's trying to be funny, emotional, or scary. On top of that, the characters are all flat, unrealistic, annoying, and all sit on the same level. By far the most obnoxious are the brothers JD and Brax. They spend a lot of time reminding you that they're brothers.
My baby bro.
Hey, my brother's talking to you.
That's me, I'm his brother.
Wait.
Hello. Hey, brothers. My brother and I.
Little bro buddy.
Little bro buddy. Brothers?
That's one of their few personality traits. Brax is Asian and gay, JD is white and straight, and they're brothers. Their fantasy is to party in a big party house. Things go south quickly when they find out that the house was previously owned by a drug dealer, who then begins killing off partygoers before targeting them. Ryan Hansen and Jimmy O. Wang are amusing actors, but the script doesn't do them any favors. Their shtick gets really old really fast. For example, every joke about the model Chastity.
Chastity?
The function of her name is purely just to be ironic.
We boned.
Chastity Belt, can you just give us a little bro time?
Kinda being a chasshole!
All of those cringe-inducing lines are delivered within a span of about 10 minutes. It's exhausting. The brothers might have been mildly amusing if the script knocked them down a good 20% and maybe sprinkled in just a pinch more depth than they like to drink and smoke weed. Next there's Patrick. Patrick's fantasy is to be a soldier. Kind of a weird thing to pick if any of your wildest dreams could come true if you ask me, but I digress. It turns out his dream was to follow in his dead father's footsteps and enlist, but his mother wouldn't let him. Instead, he's a police officer resigned to desk duty after an alleged incident. We don't ever find out anything more about him, or what the incident was, which is such a shame, as it would have made him a more well-rounded character. He yearns to be involved in some action, but as you might have guessed, his fantasy gets a little too real. Not only are there traumatic real war things going on, but his dead dad is there on the island. In fact, Patrick has been transported back to the day before his father's death. A lot of emotional father-son bonding happens here and some dramatic war dialogue. The whole arc feels especially out of place and tonally inconsistent compared to the rest of the movie. It's especially bad when it cuts from any JD and Brack's goofball scenes to Patrick tearily addressing his father. Maggie Q plays Gwen, and her sequences are hands down the least entertaining. Gwen wishes she could start her life over and accept a proposal from her ex, Alan. She's consumed by regret, but is immediately weary of the fact that Alan is somehow on the island and proposing to her. She protests that this isn't the fantasy she wanted and says that she'd like to trade her fantasy for
sex stuff.
Rourke tells her that she must go through with her fantasy for some arbitrary, mysterious reason, so Gwen agrees and lives out her dream of marrying her man. She even gets a daughter who is a bad child actor. Gwen's fantasy is probably the most realistic, but it's also the most boring. Then there's Lucy Hale's Melanie. For the first few minutes of the movie, her personality is simply being horny. She makes jokes about wanting to have sex with Patrick and the male waiters.
Pretty noisy.
I can get pretty noisy.
And her jokes are about as funny as JD and Brax's, which is to say, not very funny at all. Her fantasy is to get revenge on her childhood bully, Sloane. She assumes that Sloane will simply be a hologram, like Tupac, but is shocked to learn mid-torture that it's actually the real Sloane. She freaks out and yells that this wasn't her intention, and then breaks Sloane out. Shenanigans ensue. For a really good chunk of the movie, all of these characters are completely separate from each other. It's all just awkwardly cutting back and forth between each fantasy. You might have heard the summary of each fantasy here and asked, so when does the horror come in? Yeah, I was about 45 minutes in when I found myself asking the same thing. Really, the only horror element is in Melanie's section. There's Dr. Torture, this big surgeon who keeps trying to stab her and Sloane. The scary thing about him is that he has a bone saw and some stitches over his mouth. He pops in for a scare or two, and that's pretty much all the spook you get for the first half. You might also be asking yourself, whoa, isn't that a whole lot of plot lines for one movie? Yes, it's about 5 plot lines too many, and unfortunately, I'm not even done listing them all. While all the fantasy junk is going on, there's also a mysterious dude with a machete who keeps appearing in everyone's fantasies, all ominous-like. Turns out he was a private investigator sent to investigate the island. Apparently, he too has a tragic backstory, but by the time you get to hear what it is, your brain has already lost all its brain cells after being forced to endure this awful, awful movie. The PI leads Melanie and Sloane to a magic grotto, where all your wishes come true if you drink water from the magic fountain. You might think it couldn't get any sillier than the mystical fountain and the Deus Ex Machina PI, but wait, there's more. After the grotto is discovered, it cuts to Gwen. Gwen has suddenly decided that she shouldn't have wished for a husband, she should have saved some guy who died in a fire instead. She tricks Rourke into letting her redo her fantasy, and suddenly she's transported to an apartment building that's on fire. Surprise! It turns out that all 5 of the guests were actually there on the night that a young man named Nick died. Patrick was the on-duty cop, JD and Brax were his roommates, Melanie was heading there for a date with Nick, and Gwen was the one who actually started the fire that killed Nick to begin with. What a wild thing to introduce at the 1 hour mark, you know, 2/3 of the way into the film when you're supposed to start resolving conflicts. While Gwen is wading through all that exposition, Patrick and the brothers' fantasies start to converge. Here it's revealed that the drug dealers on the island bleed black blood and are unkillable zombies or something. It's not clear, but they never really explain it, so let's just move on. It also suddenly gets very melodramatic when JD dies during a drug dealer zombie gunfight. Patrick's dead dad also dies again, and there's the classic cliche big Okay, so fire, drug dealer zombies, sudden death, and magic fountain. We get all that in like 20 minutes. Truly awful pacing, but surely that's the climax of this madness, right? Nope. Somehow there's more. Gwen gets pulled out of the apartment complex fantasy and fails to save Nick, but suddenly drops the ominous line,
I think this is someone else's fantasy.
The group meets back up and assumes that Nick's mum actually stuck everyone on the island for revenge. Melanie hypothesizes that Rourke's assistant Julia is actually Nick's mum. Surely this is the answer and the movie's resolution is near, right? No, wait, there's another plot twist. This is actually Melanie's fantasy. Melanie blames everyone on the island for Nick's death. She thinks Patrick, Gwen, JD and Brax were responsible. Sloane is just there as an added bonus. Why stop at killing 4 strangers when you can throw in your childhood bully too? Everyone gets tortured by their worst nightmares in the grotto for a while, and then Melanie brutally stabs Patrick. There's so much going on that it's weirdly boring. This big reveal doesn't have much of an impact because it's super convoluted and contrived. You're telling me that Melanie went through all this trouble of dramatically saving Sloane as an act? Why? Why would she go through all this trouble when she could have just had them kidnapped and strapped to torture chairs? And would you believe that there's another twist after that? Suddenly, Rourke drops the bomb that his personal assistant Julia is actually his dead wife. Gwen dramatically tells him that their love is fake and that Rourke is living a lie, but Rourke just throws a grenade in the magic pond and leaves, as you do. 5 minutes later though, he sees Julia coughing up blood and she convinces him that he does need to save the day and blah blah blah, who cares anymore? Julia's character isn't developed either, she's just been hanging out in the background coughing, and unfortunately this makes her emotional moment fall really flat. After this, Sloane drinks the magic wish-granting water that she's been carrying around for half the movie. This all could have ended a lot sooner if she'd just taken a swig earlier, but of course Rourke had to go finish his dumb character arc first, because plot. Sloane wishes that Melanie and Nick could be together forever, and Nick's charred body drags Melanie down into the fountain. And then the movie finally ends and, wait, I'm just playing. One last twist. Melanie pops back out of the fountain and throws a grenade at them, as you do. Patrick finally gets his heroic moment and throws himself on the grenade, saving the day but killing himself in the process. The remaining survivors pop back into the resort lobby and are finally able to go home. Brax, however, asks for one last wish. He asks for JD to come back to life. Rourke says yes, but only if Brax agrees to stay on Fantasy Island forever, which he agrees to. This part is really funny to me because no one really mourns Patrick's death even though he'd sacrificed himself for them, or even attempts to save him. The movie is just like, well, thanks for sacrificing yourself, mate, but we're gonna let the blonde party boy live instead. Finally, the movie is over, but wait, there's one last eye roll to be had. Brax reveals that his college nickname was Tattoo. This is a shout out to the original television series and reveals that this whole movie is actually a prequel to the 70s show. But again, I doubt that any OG Fantasy Island fans came out to see this movie, so that little scene means pretty much nothing to most of the people who saw it in theaters. Despite my complaints, I will admit that the acting isn't particularly bad. Ryan Hansen is doing his typical amusing frat boy shtick well enough, Maggie Q is sufficiently dramatic, and Lucy Hale as Melanie is genuinely a solid casting choice given her previous role in the equally batshit teen drama Pretty Little Liars. It's a pretty decent looking flick too. The cinematographer Toby Oliver actually shot the outstanding Get Out, and there's enough money spent on the film to make the sets and location look real. Even the soundtrack by Bear McCreary, known for his work on Godzilla, King of the Monsters, and the Walking Dead television series, was great. But the script is just all over the place. The main characters meet at the start, and their personal stories don't intertwine until the very end. Even then, it's a superficial connection. What we think is driving them turns out to be a lie, and we're left with more plot twists than an M. Night script. It felt more like an episode of The Twilight Zone than a typical Blumhouse horror. Still, as ridiculous as the story is, this might be a fun one to throw on and watch with friends if you enjoy watching bad movies. So as long as you're not expecting any sort of substantial cinematic experience or any actual scares, Fantasy Island is entertaining in a so bad it's good kind of way. It's worth a watch in that situation, but hey, if that's what you're after, you may as well go see the master, Tommy Wiseau, do the same thing but 100 times better in The Room.
What a story, Mark.
With that having been said, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to hit subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content, and if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Nihat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.